Before we move any further, let me go ahead and explain these annotations that you see here at SpringBootApplication, RestController, as well as GetMapping. First, let's start with SpringBootApplication. So this annotation right here. So within the textbook, you can see that I have a section on annotations, and this annotation at SpringBootApplication is part of Spring Boot. And basically it's a wrapper for encapsulating add configuration, add enable auto configuration, and add component scan. So instead of you having these three annotations, you could just have this one right here, and it's like you having these three annotations. But what do they really mean? Let's begin with add configuration, which is part of Spring. In here, if I click on Spring, you can see that we have a bunch of annotations. And right here, if I click on configuration, you see that the add configuration basically is used for configuration classes and conventionally called app config. This is where you have a bunch of configuration code for your application. Maybe you've got some connection details of your database, so the username, the password, and you want to have a class that basically binds those properties into your class or bean. Then you can use add configuration in here. Now you'll see throughout this course how we're going to use these annotations, but in a nutshell, that's what it does. Then moving on to the add enable auto configuration. So this annotation right here makes Spring to guess the configuration based on the jar files available on the class path. So if you've got some libraries, it can basically configure it for you without you having to do anything. And I'm going to show you in a second how all of this works. And finally, we have add component scan. And this one right here, so add component scan, it's right here. So add component scan. And basically it's responsible for telling Spring where to look for components. So this annotation is part of the Spring Boot application, as I said, and by default, Spring will search within the package that the main class is located. So if you have the root package, then it will look for components within the root package. Now, let me actually show you all of this in action. So back to IntelliJ, and right here, if I basically press command and then click on Spring Boot application, I can navigate into it right here. And you can see that basically this right here, it's an interface, Spring Boot application. And more specific, it's actually an annotation, and this is how you define annotations. And basically, if I scroll down, you can see that it's an alias for enable auto configuration, component scan, as well as configuration in here. Now, if I close this, and if I was to comment this out, and here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that this is add component scan and also add enable auto configuration. Or in fact, let me just remove this and I want to show you something. So if I restart the application, you can see that web application could not be started as there was no, and then org spring framework.boot and then the servlet in here, right? So basically, it's telling us to check dependencies for supported servlet web server, right? So we know that we have Tomcat installed as a dependency, but at the moment, there's no way for configuring it because we haven't told it to do so. So here, this is where at, and then enable auto configuration comes in. If I run this, you can see that now the application starts on port 8080. So here, if I hide this, also what I forgot to show you is, so within component scan, here we can say base packages, and we can basically say com.amigos code. So I'm actually telling it the package that it should look for components. And I'll show you components in a second, as well as beans. But if I run this works as well. So here we are being basically more specific on the packages that we want the components to be instantiated from. This is it, right? So these annotations right here. And also you saw that there's the at configuration. And basically, if we have any bean inside that we want to instantiate, this annotation in here works quite well with it. But if I restart, I just want to show you that basically everything works as before, but instead we just have one single annotation right here, which is Spring Boot application. Without this annotation, the application will not start. So if I remove this, run it, you can see that we get an error, and basically it's missing annotations on how to configure things properly. But this annotation, it's very important, and you'll see it in all main classes for Spring Boot applications. If you have any questions on this annotation, please do let me know. Next, let me briefly talk about RestController as well as GetMapping.